Hi everyone, welcome to our session today. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority acknowledges the continuing sea country custodianship of the Great Barrier Reef by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, whose rich cultures, heritage values, enduring connections and shared efforts protect the reef for future generations. So welcome once again to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority's National Science Week webinar about how we integrate natural and social science for the well-being of people connected to protecting the Great Barrier Reef. My name's Michelle Dyer. I'm going to host us today, and I am one of the science team in Reef Knowledge at GBRMPA, joined by my colleagues Dr Mel Cowlishaw and Dr Jessica Stella. So together the three of us form a mini science team inside Reef Knowledge, and we're a combination of natural and social scientists. I'm an anthropologist by trade, and Dr Cowlishaw and Dr Stella are both marine scientists. So just to begin, Mel, can you tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about your role here and your journey into this career?
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm a marine scientist with the authority. I've been working with the authority for over 12 years now. I always had an affinity for the water as a child, and I loved science through high school, and so it was natural progression for me to do a Bachelor of Marine Science at university. I completed my undergrad at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, and then I headed up to Townsville and did my PhD at James Cook University. My PhD was on reef fish behaviour. So from there, I landed a job with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, originally in the Environmental Impact Assessment team. And over time, my roles have changed and moved into strategic policy, offsets, and planning, and then more recently as part of the team that makes sure that managers have the best science available to them for their decision making.
Thanks, Mel. And Jess, what about you? What was your journey into this career?
It was a bit of a long one, actually. It started when I was out of high school. I went to college first as a pre-veterinary student and decided I didn't like dealing with blood and guts. I became a travel agent, and then I had my first scuba dive when I was 24, and I knew at that moment that that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So I pursued a degree in biology, moved over from Boston to Townsville to finish my undergrad at JCU. Then I completed honours and started a PhD looking at the effects of climate change on coral-reliant invertebrates. While I was finishing that PhD, I started working at the authority about 5 years ago, so just kind of prior to the 2016 mass bleaching event. So it was a bit eye-opening writing about climate change and its potential effects for my whole thesis, and then actually seeing those unfold as soon as I started my job at the authority. So.
Thanks, Jess. And just briefly about myself, I have a degree and a PhD in anthropology, and I spent some years just travelling around the world teaching English, actually, before returning to academia about 14 or so years ago now, and I spent about 10 years teaching and doing research at James Cook University here in Townsville. And then I moved to Sweden for a couple of years and worked with the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University in Sweden. So really focusing on resilience and social ecological systems understanding. And my main focus there was actually gender equality and social justice in international development. And then I returned to Townsville in October of 2018, sorry, and took up the job with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. So, and sorry, I should have mentioned other work prior to Sweden was around environmental anthropology. So that's the connection with moving into reef management. So we're just thinking about what is science for the reef. And Jess was going to give a little blurb here on what we think science for the reef is.
Well, science for the reef, one, it's a process. So science is constantly evolving. It's a trial and error, it's hypothesis testing, it's constantly learning new things to enhance our understanding about the reef. We use science because we want to understand how healthy the reef is and what its current condition is, as well as how it's trending. So there's lots of different indicators that we can look at. If we're looking at just the coral reef habitats, it might be coral cover, could be an indication of coral reef health. So similar to the human body where we study nutrition, we want to know what's good for it, what kind of foods, what exercise, what temperatures are optimal. So we try to learn all of those things about the reef so that we can enhance its resilience and keep it around for generations to come. Not always very easy given the size of it and the depth, the breadth. It's hard to get to every place on the reef, but trying to keep our finger on the pulse of what the science is telling us enables us to be really adaptable with how we make decisions in managing the reef for the best outcomes.
And I should have said earlier, but I forgot, for all of you joining us today, if you have questions during this little webinar, feel free to just pop them in the chat. And if we see them pop up and we can answer them during the webinar, we will, or we can save that for the question and answer session at the end. So Jess, when we spoke earlier about doing this webinar, you had a nice analogy about science and the body. So would you mind sharing that again with us?
So when my analogy was that the reef is kind of like the human body, that we want to study the different things that are good for it, and as well as determine the things that are bad for it. So certain things that stress it out. Using coronavirus is a very good example these days. If you're feeling run down, you might be more prone to catching illness or disease. Corals are the same way. There's a lot of other organisms on the reef that react to stressors such as high water temperatures, poor water quality, runoff, coastal development. All these different stresses actually compound and put pressure on the reef. So just like the human body, we want to be able to study its overall fitness and what we can do to alleviate those pressures and make it healthier. That way, animals are healthier. We can enjoy a multi-use marine park with fishing, with live healthy coral, with migrating whales, turtles, and all these animals are spawning healthily. So it's really just about studying what is the good things, what are the bad things, and trying to make that balance so we're always on the positive, adding more good things into the reef than we are stressing it out.
Yeah, thanks. And Mel, if I could direct this question to you, how do we apply this science for reef management?
It's a good question, Michelle, because as Jess pointed out, you know, the Great Barrier Reef, like all coral reefs globally, is under pressure, and it's this vast interconnected space. Yet it's also has many uses, from traditional, commercial, recreational, and even scientific research. So as reef managers, we need to find the balance between protecting, you know, the corals and the fish and the biodiversity that people can see, but then also, I guess, the economic value and the personal value that people get from the reef as well. So, you know, the approach that we are taking is one of what we call a social ecological approach. And I might hand it over to you as the best person to explain what that is.
I don't know if I'm the best person in the world to explain what that is, but I'll give it a try. So social ecological, obviously traditionally we have divided ourselves scientifically into the social disciplines and the, let's say for the sake of this discussion, environmental or ecological. So the idea with a social ecological approach is it's a clumsy use of the only language we have available to us, is putting a hyphen between them to say, well, we're actually looking at this as one system. So it's a systems approach that says there's all these different components. Some of them are biophysical, some of them are social, but they're not in separate places. They're all in the system. So these are all components of the system, and they all interact with each other in different ways. They might be multiple interactions. Well, there is multiple interactions of one component with other components, and there's feedbacks between things. So, you know, if you affect one thing, that's going to have other effects on other parts of the system, and that again loops back and feeds back in. So that's the kind of systems approach that brings us to think about the social and ecological as part of the same system and affecting each other, and trying to understand what are these feedback loops. So for example, if we're taking a management approach, we understand that there's a pressure on something on the reef. We're trying to identify what's causing that pressure. We apply a management response. The management response itself is part of the system, is part of the social ecological system. So what's the effect of that management response? And not just on the thing that we think we're addressing in the biophysical sense, but also on the people that are part of the system. Is that going to lead to further positive effects for reef health? Is it going to lead to possibly some negative effects for reef health by the way the people are behaving? So it's really about understanding the feedback between social change and conditions and reef health, and the feedback between reef health change and conditions. So it helps us understand what management activities we can take, and what effect that these are having on the system as a whole. So that means both the reef and the people, which we understand as existing in interconnected way. So I hope that made sense to everyone. And this is not like a new, particularly, I didn't make this up, obviously. This is a whole field of science, and resilience is a really key part. So like Jess was talking about the human body, and if you're already under a lot of stress, you're going to be less resilient and less able to cope with extra pressures. So the idea of a systems approach under the rubric of what is resilience is like, well, how can we help the system as a whole, both the people in the system and the biophysical aspects of the system, to be more resilient, so that we can cope with change and we can adapt with change, and we still keep the system functioning as a whole. So I can't see any chat questions there. So I might just move on. I have another question I was going to direct to Jess. And the question was, there's this term reef grief that I've heard going around before, and I just wanted to ask if you could explain what that means.
I guess that is a somewhat new term, probably best described after the 2016 mass bleaching event on the reef. So it's a term used to describe the emotional response to an ecosystem degradation or loss, and it's grief, as we all experience human grief, a profound sense of loss over species or an ecosystem or a meaningful landscape. You know, research has shown that a lot of Australians, and particularly Queenslanders, have a deep and personal connection to the Great Barrier Reef, and to see it come into harm's way through the pressures of climate change, it could be through mass bleaching, through a cyclone, you know, destroying a reef that you maybe grew up diving on and that you're really familiar. So just like a landscape that you're very familiar with, like a forest that you used to go hiking in, you know, seeing it burn down would be, have an overwhelming effect on you and your sense of well-being. So it kind of reflects that deep and personal connection with the reef, and how people are responding to seeing it degrade and seeing the loss in coral habitats. I know for me, it was deeply moving seeing the 2016, 17, and 2020 bleaching events happen, not only for the initial shock of seeing a beautiful underwater landscape of coral bleaching, because it is startlingly beautiful, vivid in colors, and at that time when the corals are still alive, the fish are all still there, so it's really beautiful. Watching it over a few months after bleaching, as slowly the coral started to die and get overgrown with algae, and the fish disappear, and then, you know, the next dive might be like a graveyard. It's just unrecognizable from what it was. And I do remember getting out of one of those dives, and I could smell my wetsuit, and it smelled like death. Coral's smelly to begin with, but when it dies, the smell is just horrendous. And, you know, I cried. There's a lot of people that would have done the same thing. It's, you know, watching something that you love die, just like watching a family member waste away from an illness would be the same thing. So it does, you know, it reflects the strong connection that people have with the Great Barrier Reef. And hopefully it also calls to action their will and desire to protect it for future generations.
Thanks, Jess. It was a bit sad, but I think it's a reality we're facing. Mel, did you have anything you wanted to add? I mean, we know it seems like coral bleaching is a lot of the science that we hear about in the mainstream media and is probably more widely known to the general public. But, you know, what other science is there? There is more than coral on the reef.
There is, absolutely. And I think, you know, unfortunately, many of us have stories like Jess's, but for someone who is obviously a fish enthusiast, that's what my PhD was in, you know, it's really important to understand the role that, you know, various animals, whether it's fish, microbes, invertebrates, play in helping the reef to maintain its resilience. So as we were talking about, it's that systems approach, you know, back to Jess's analogy, your body just doesn't work with its brain. You need its heart, you need its lungs, you need its intestines. So it all sort of feeds off each other and is interconnected. And it's really important that the science that we use as managers takes into consideration all those biophysical elements, plus the comments you were making, Michelle, about, you know, the human dimensions to some of this work as well is really important.
Yeah, and I think that makes me think it's important to say, I think that the complexity of the reef and humans on the earth, like, you know, we are other organisms on the earth as well. Like, none of this is existing in isolation. We all just have the one biosphere, but that it is so complex, and that science isn't a thing, you know, science isn't a spanner you can use to tighten a bolt. Science is, when we use the word science, we're talking about a process of inquiry and of systematically and with methodological rigor, like trying to understand how things work. So yeah, we're really talking about process and method and obviously analysis and bringing all those things together. And I think what you both when you were both speaking, then I was thinking about, you know, it is so complex. There's so many parts to all of this that it's really takes a systematic approach to even try and get your head around any of it, which is why we use science and why social science is a science. You know, we're not just going on anecdotes or what we think might be happening or, you know, easily observable assumptions or things like that. We actually need to apply scientific method to try and wrap our heads around this level of complexity. And even then, I mean, you know, it's isn't there we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the what's underwater.
So Michelle, you might hear that a little bit then, just reflecting on the comment you made then about social science is a science. Now obviously Jess and I, we are very much in that natural science. Jess studied invertebrates, I studied fish. You know, do you have people ask you, is social science a science?
Well, a lot of people think that because they're a person, then obviously they also doing social science, but that's probably a bit like me saying, well, I eat fish, so clearly I know a lot about it. But, you know, I think it comes down to scientific method. Not everything about being social or understanding social systems is necessarily social science. So it's about, can you use a scientific method that is repeatable, that is verifiable? And again, it's about the body of scholarship. You know, like that's the basis of how all our science works, is that we are all part of building drops in the bucket of understanding in a larger body of scholarship. And the goal, of course, always is you have to build on previous understanding. So social science is the same, you know, you have to build on the work that's gone before you. You also have to use theory. So theory is just a testing of the way things are, like it is in the natural sciences as well. I think the thing that trips a lot of people up is all of us, our lives are made up of so many millions and billions of personal interactions. And I think we're all amateur psychologists and amateur anthropologists and amateur whatever at trying to understand our own lives. And I wouldn't make any claim that social science is somehow above that and understands everything. It's more just about applying a very systematic approach so that you can say, it's not just what I reckon, it's from this empirical data collected in a way that is rigorous and methodologically sound, applying particular analytical methods and being able to show where your conclusions come from. So yes, social science is a science, and possibly always wrongly called the soft science. I'm never entirely sure why it's a soft science, because it's really hard, frankly.
Maybe because it deals with matters of the heart as well. Even
yeah, I don't know. Matters of the heart. Mm. So I didn't have any more questions that I had down for you and Jess, you and Mel. But did you have any further comments or questions? I can't see any questions from our audience members.
I think what you said earlier, making that comparison about the surface of the moon and our deep sea, you know, that's a point to really drive home, because I think people assume that we should know everything that there is to know about the Great Barrier Reef and about coral reef habitats. But scuba diving wasn't invented 200 years ago. It's a relatively new field. So we've really, in recent times, we've only been studying it for a nanosecond. So really impossible to tell how many species there are and how everything is working, in terms of functioning in the ecosystem, food webs, all the different ecological services that coral reefs provide. So it's often a question we get, well, what were coral reefs like before European settlement or hundreds of years ago? And it's just not something that we can really answer because no one was looking, compared to terrestrial ecosystems such as rainforests, where they've been studying them for years and they have good baseline data. So yeah, I think that's something people should keep in mind, that it's still a pretty new science.
That's a good point, Jess, because it's also just a pretty new Western science. I think the first expeditions or scientific expeditions on the Great Barrier Reef were in the early or mid 1920s. Whereas our, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the custodians of the reef, their knowledge spans, tens of thousands of years. Mm. And the thing that I think I found most interesting in my role is taking my perspective and my education and my training and looking at the reef, and also looking at it with a traditional owner and seeing, I guess, or learning from them the different ways that they look at the reef and how they use the fish and the turtles and the various different elements of the habitat to talk about, future health and trajectories and how they interact with it. So it's really, whilst we talk about a social ecological approach, traditional knowledge is also a key component of that.
That's a nice segue, actually, Mel. There's a question there saying, how does social ecological approach and findings feed into management decisions from the reef? So I think that's a really nice segue to say that, when management of the reef is obviously about the health of the reef, but it's management. So management is actually about people. And even the process of management is a people process. And there are many different perspectives, and obviously traditional owners are the traditional custodians and owners of the country. And as you say, have a much, much longer history of knowledge and understanding than Western science of this system. So while I'm not making any claims that we are able to even understand that or fully take it into consideration in management decisions, social ecological approach in itself, management is in the social ecological approach. So in taking that view, it's to see management inside the system as well. So we don't imagine ourselves as somehow outside doing something to the system. I did see, I'm conscious of the time, I did see another question there. A question here from Josh Ames. I came in a bit late, so I'm sorry if you've already covered this, but what do you think is the most effective way for social and natural scientists to collaborate in cross-applicable areas such as conservation? Interesting to hear all of your perspectives. Someone else want to speak first to that?
I guess from my perspective, I think communication is key. And the first step is actually, you know, recognizing that it's not just your area of expertise or your field that you should be focusing on. As Michelle said, it is about taking that system-wide approach. And it's also about, I guess, working with partners and stakeholders to workshop and discuss different issues. I mean, if you don't have that opportunity to cross-collaborate, you know, Michelle and I and Jess have been sort of working together for the last few months now. And I must admit, when I first met Michelle, some of the things that she was saying really hurt my brain, because my brain was used to working very much in a natural science kind of way. And so it did take me a little while to sort of translate her way of looking at things and try and find a way that the two fit together. But I think we've achieved that. And, you know, I think we've done that by continually talking to each other, continually testing each other's views, and, you know, just making sure that we're continuing to move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. I'm sorry I hurt your brain. As long as I didn't hurt your feelings, I think that's
No,
okay.
not at all.
I think from what I would say, I've been a lone social scientist in a biophysical space for a while now, not just here at GBRMPA. But I think I would say that it's a process. There's no like 6 steps to success type of thing. It's actually a process, and it's about loving the fact that bringing together many different perspectives gives you something bigger than the sum of the parts. And, you know, embracing that and just being prepared to keep your mind open and not getting attached to the idea that your perspective is the right perspective. Obviously, like all good science, you have to give that up anyway. But yeah, I think communication is absolutely key. And in my experience, it takes, you know, you need to have a lot of conversations so that you don't make assumptions about the language that you're using, because across the natural and social sciences, we can often use the same word to mean different things, or we have real concepts attached to particular terms. So it's really in that process of not assuming and having multiple conversations around things that you start to get really rich, fruity results. But yeah, there's a lot of good work actually about that. Josh, who asked the question, and something I'm always looking up, there's blogs, there's all sorts of things, because obviously this is our understanding of being in the Anthropocene and humans being the biggest force for change in the natural environment on the planet really needs us as scientists to come together in this way. Sorry, I am also conscious of the time. Oh, and someone's posted a presentation you might be interested in. So thank you very much for that, Mike, who's posted that presentation. So I think we might have to wrap up there. Thanks everyone so much for joining us today. I hope that's been of interest and of use to you. I encourage everybody to join the other webinars that we have going on this week. You can just head to our website, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority website, and there's a whole lot of virtual events going on throughout the National Science Week, which focus on how the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority uses science for management. And you can ask questions and talk to all of our amazing team here at the authority. So thanks again for joining us. Wishing you all a lovely day.